Foti Koskinas began his career as a police officer in 1996. After several promotions, including work as a canine handler, assignments with drug enforcement, and a number of awards, including the Medal of Valor, he's been the Westport Police Chief since 2016. Chief Koskinas has attended the FBI Regional Command College and the Anti-Defamation League's Advanced Training School, as well as various leadership courses at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He's officially Fotius Koskinas, but like Cher, Bono, Madonna, and Pelé, everybody in Westport knows our police chief by one name, Foti. Foti, it's an honor to have you here today on 06880, the podcast. So let's start with your backstory. It's really fascinating. English is not your first language. In fact, you didn't speak it until 7th grade, right?
Correct. I moved to the U.S., first move right to Westport, Connecticut from Athens, Greece, for 6th grade. So going into 6th grade, not a word of English. Nobody's fault but mine. My parents well aware that we were moving to the U.S. and tried, but I fought it every step of the way until I found myself in 6th grade, Mrs. Eichert's class at Longlots, where you knew everybody there. And that was my first experience trying to navigate through the new life.
Wow. And so you picked up the language at Longlots and then Staples.
Right, it was a little harder than just picked up the language. It took quite a bit of work and incredible teachers that gave me incredible amounts of time before school, after school, completely different. I mean, they really took me in if I was one of their own. But yes, Longlots and Staples were great experiences. I went on to play different sports. I wrestled, played football, I played lacrosse. It was a great experience.
Wow. So you're a Westporter.
Yes, in a sense, very much so, yes.
You really are. But you did not plan to go into policing, right?
I did not. I went to school for engineering. I had friends that were in the criminal justice program, so I did take a few courses. I did graduate with a minor in criminal justice with a level of interest in it. But I was working for a law firm as a paralegal in New York City and was not happy with what I was doing. So this was something I was going to try out for a year or 2 years until I found myself. And I'm still looking.
Aren't we all? And how'd you end up on the Westport Force?
So I applied to a few different police departments. I applied primarily Fairfield County and a few federal agencies. The federal agencies, the feedback was you need some work experience or a law degree or an accounting degree at the time. If we rewind back to the 90s, that's what they were looking for. So at the same time, I had an offer here, Stanford, and the town of Fairfield. Being that it was my hometown, I took the opportunity and came on. Haven't really looked back. The opportunities did come for the federal jobs twice on 2 different occasions. And at the time, life takes its shape and family, wife, child on the way. It wasn't the time for another big relocation.
Wow. Do you remember your first assignments in Westport?
I did. Well, your first assignments when you get hired in Westport, I remember coming out in the middle of winter, and for a month I had to walk the holiday traffic details in Westport Center. In Westport Center, I mean, it's very vibrant now, but in a different way, it was even more vibrant then. I mean, it was a very busy place. So I did that for a month and then slowly acclimated to my patrol duties like every new officer does. And then a year into it, I started finding my way, whether it was the canine program or drug enforcement or a regional SWAT team. I had a great career as a patrol officer. I really got to experience quite a bit.
I think people don't realize how much the Westport Police Department does. We don't necessarily think of canine. We don't think of drug enforcement. It's really charged with a lot.
Right. So we're unique in many ways. First of all, we're located, we can't forget that we're 45 miles out of New York City. And we're about 2 hours out of Boston. So these are major traffic ways for good and bad. That's the best way to put it. Most of our people use it as a way of getting back and forth from work, but we can't be blind to drug trafficking, weapon trafficking, money laundering, human trafficking, even more so now than ever, that goes directly from New York to Boston or just travels through. 95 is a huge corridor for all those activities. And having Route 1, 2 major train stations, and the Merritt Parkway just makes it even more desirable for those kind of activities because you have alternate routes. You don't have to stick on one route as you're navigating through. So while there's so much good going on and commerce is incredible, and the opportunity to live in a community like this and be an hour out from New York, that welcomes a whole different type of element and exposes us to many different things. So Westport really puts out quite a bit. I mean, we have our own dive team. We have our own, we're part of a regional SWAT team with 7 other communities, and that's both for resources and cost savings. It would be very expensive, and we wouldn't have the resources if it was just in Westport. And then it grows from there. A Marine division that operates from Memorial Day to Labor Day. There's some morale growing activities, like there's an honor guard, there's the police athletic league, PBA. There's so much that goes on.
And how many people?
So we have 64 sworn police officers, but we oversee the railroad operation, and we also oversee the EMS paramedic operations. So between paid staff and volunteers, it's well over 200 staff.
Wow. How has the force, the Westport Police Department, evolved in the 25 years you've been there?
So I think we've always been ahead of the curve. Training was always at the forefront of prior chiefs, certainly even before I started here. Chief Luciano was the first real training officer that set up the police academy in Connecticut. So to look back, there was definitely a focus in training and being ahead of the curve when it came to policing in the town of Westport. That being said, I think our biggest shift, I found myself in 2016, early 2016, becoming the chief, and I had certainly worked with the prior chief, Dale Call, who I was very good friends with, but we found ourselves, and certainly found myself, that we were operating under a duty manual from 1972. It was 6 months older than I was. So our real reform when it came to modern day policing really started in 2015, 2016, certainly at the start of Chief Call before he left and me taking over from that point on. But it was quite a bit of work when we looked at it. Now, if you had asked me, would you have done it the same way or any way different? I can't tell you how happy I was and how I found myself in a good place as things were unfolding a year and a half, 14 months ago at the national level, and police departments were being asked by their communities, whether small or large, to meet certain expectations, primarily things like excessive force, illicit bias training, the chokehold issue that came up that we saw in multiple jurisdictions. We met every one of those expectations and demands and exceeded them the day that we were asked. We didn't wait for the George Floyd incident or another tragedy to take reform seriously.
So what sort of... So in other words, when you redid the manual...
So we became an accredited organization at the state level, meeting state and national standards, which is best practices as any other industry, and actually having written policies and procedures that were clearly identifiable to the officers working and the public that we serve at any point that they asked. Now, that sounds easy. It's probably one of the most difficult tasks because every department's different. We have the luxury in the U.S. that every community can sort of shape what they want their police force to be like. But unlike other countries where there's national policing and the policies and procedures are the same across the board, that creates its own challenges.
So what does Westport want its police force to be like?
I think Westport has always made it very clear that they want to continue to be a very safe community, and they are. But they also want the police to be a helper, a guardian. We want to take things seriously, like when we say protect and serve, we want to realize that this job is 95, if not 98% serving, and maybe 2 to 3% protecting, and certainly be prepared that when we do have to put that hat on to protect, that we're certainly able to, and we can do it more than adequately. We can excel at it, but understanding our primary role is to serve the community.
I don't think it's a secret that Westporters are demanding, that, we sometimes feel entitled. That's probably a tough dynamic. If you're an officer, particularly if you didn't grow up here or don't live here, in fact, if you live far away.
Right. So I can't, maybe this is an opportunity to actually thank our community through the most difficult of times. I don't think, and I'm not doing it as the politically correct answer, I wouldn't use the word entitled. I would use the word that they know what they want and they deserve it. I mean, they're paying top dollar for their services, and anytime you pay that kind of level for service, you should expect nothing but the best, and you should certainly hold the people accountable that are providing that service. That being said, through the worst of times at the national level, our community has rallied behind us. Which is really what keeps me going. One of the things that will probably come up in conversation is succession planning. As Deputy Chief Archiola and I look to exit, where is the department? Where do we go? And the community has stood behind us every step of the way. When we had the rallies, at no point, other than a few outsiders that came in, it was not an adversarial event. It was an event that we stood together for what we believed. It wasn't standing against each other because we had to.
So what was that like? That's a great point. What was that like for you during the Black Lives Matter movement where, the country was really, plenty of communities were up in arms against their own police.
Right.
And that didn't happen in Westport. What did you do to make it happen? What did the community do?
So there were a lot of unknowns. I wish I could tell you that when it started, I went to bed at night thinking that there's not going to be any problems and this is going to be smooth. And it wasn't. There were certainly some people that were trying to make more of it, and there were certainly officers that were upset that this was going on because they felt, I've been providing incredible service, I've been doing the right things, but I'm being lumped into at the national level. I think one of the things that worked very well is we really opened up to the rallies or protests and said, come on in, we're here with you. We're not turning you away. We're not going to restrict you. We're not looking to make arrests. As long as you respect our community and you respect the people who are there and the police, there's not going to be any issues. But one thing that worked really well is we met with all the organizers before the event and made that message very clear that we're here with you. We're not against you, but there are boundaries. And if you start disrespecting or damaging or taking things away from our community, the outcome will be very different than if we all stand together. And I don't think at any point their intentions, there were some outsiders and some agitators that came in, but the best part about that was seeing our community shut that down.
Wow. When you went into policing, did you think that social justice was going to be one of the things that you would deal with?
Yeah, Mr. Woog, I did, only for the reason because I came on right on the heels of Rodney King and the Louima case in New York. That was 1996. So on a different level, I came in on the heels of those events, and sort of my training was based around it. So I was well aware of it. The difference then was the social media and the way information was shared was at a completely different level. So as things were unraveling, everything seemed to be live time. And a lot of it was live time, but not really accurate. People will show you what they wanted you to see to almost inflate or, exaggerate what the issues were. And in some other cases, the other way, depending on which side of the aisle you stood on, you really had to look at multiple news sources and really take it in what was actually happening. Don't focus on what one report.
So how does it make you feel, when you're serving the community and doing something you love and in a profession that you care for and respect, and you see this national conversation going in directions that are different from Westport?
All right, this is a tough one because of obviously both national and local politics and everything that goes on. It's disheartening at times because the truth of the matter is most people in their lifetime don't encounter the police, and a majority of the ones that do are relatively experiences that they need them and the police are helpful. But we highlight the incidents, and we absolutely should. We shouldn't allow those incidents to slide by if they didn't happen, but we spend a lot more time on those incidents. On a given day, there's probably millions of calls that are served by police officers across the country, uniformed police officers across the country. And to look at the few bad ones that we should absolutely focus on, try to improve, prevent the reoccurrence, all the right things that we should be doing, we should also realize a lot of good work is done, regardless of skin color, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of race, sexual preference. All those things are put aside. There's a lot of men and women really dumping their heart and soul and blood, sweat, and tears for the better of the community. And as we hear things as defund the police or different there's nobody else when things go terribly bad to replace what a police officer does. If there is a plan of what that would be and how it would work, maybe we can venture down those areas. But we're seeing all those areas that we're pushing for heavy reduction in budgets and police officers, they're struggling. I mean, those communities are really struggling to the point that they've reinstituted budgets, they've increased budgets, but now we're playing catch up because we've also created an environment that the officers are hesitant to respond. The force by size has been reduced because of people just leaving. It's not a pleasant profession, and most people have other opportunities. So we've created an area that not a lot of people want to get into this job. As soon as people become eligible to leave, they leave the job. So it's going to be a little bit of an uphill battle and a corrective measure to get back to where we were.
So this is fascinating. I'm learning a ton of stuff. So what is your, as chief, what do you do to create, concretely, to create an environment, where, your officers really buy into what you're doing and all that, and B, to recruit them in a tough environment?
I wish I could tell you I had the perfect formula. I've been living the last year in a place, when I say my entire management team, and I'll speak for other management teams of chief executives and other police chiefs, in an area that at times it's seen that if you do too much for the guys and stick up for them, people will say you're betraying your community. Or if you do a lot for your community and don't stick up for the guys and girls, they'll say you're betraying the profession and them. So it is a tough balancing act. It's a real tough balancing act to navigate through this. And also realize that we all, just because we wear the uniform, we don't all have the same beliefs of how things should be. But it is understood that once you put the uniform on, we all have to be unified and have a common goal. That's not like many other jobs. I mean, unless you compare to the military, which is, yes, we're paramilitary, but very different from the military. There's not a lot of jobs that is actually the case. You almost have to put some of your beliefs aside for what your organization and what your expectations of your job are.
Wow. So how about let's give a shout out to some of the members of the force. What are some of the things that the public might not know?
Right,
You mentioned broadly the Marine Division and all that, but a few specific things that you're really proud of.
What I really applaud is the officers that day in and day out do the right thing when nobody's looking. And that's the hardest part, because they'll never get acknowledged. And I see those every single day, and I try to acknowledge them, and I probably only see a fraction of those activities. So the ones that really matter is for the officer who's doing the right thing when nobody's looking. And I can tell you that there's an unbelievable amount of that goes on, or else we couldn't have the successes that we do. But
so what's an example?
An example is whether, for most recently, and you and I talked about it, we did a food drive for Homes with Hope. And the feedback I got from the officers of how they were treated by people, and the thank yous, and the people from Homes with Hope, that's just one example. I mean, we've had some major tragedies in our community the last couple months. The feedback from the families of how they were treated by the police officers, the feedback from the neighbors of how they were treated by the police officers. I received letters on a weekly basis of people that were stopped by our officers and actually got a ticket, and they couldn't believe how well they were treated. I mean, an officer that's very active that, someone else has not been happy with in the past, not because they did anything wrong, just the way that they were treated, to all of a sudden get letters and be like, you know what, I was hoping for a warning, I got a ticket, I got a lesson, but I can't tell you how grateful I am about how your officer treated me.
Wow.
So those kind of things start falling into place. The other part is we don't have major, and this could change at a moment's notice, discipline issues that you see. We're a pretty big department by national standards. We would be considered medium to large. Most departments across the country are 5 people, 7 people, 20 people. We don't have a lot of the internal issues. And a lot of that comes back to not that we're perfect, and not that I don't think at night that something could go wrong, but the men and women of the department take a lot of pride in what they do. And if there is somebody amongst them that is not with the norm or may influence or make them look bad or their profession, they're very outspoken in addressing it within the ranks. A lot of things don't have to make it to my office before corrective action is taken. Yeah. And I credit the first line supervisors and the men and women who work with these people.
Wow. So what does an officer spend a lot of his or her time doing?
Right now, we're dealing with a lot of traffic issues. Traffic is at the forefront, and a lot of people would think there's an easy solution, and we try to meet with as many of them as possible. There's, I don't want to upset anybody, but there is definitely a lack of civility in how people drive. Complete disrespect, whether it be the distracted driving. I don't think people realize that a yellow light means actually come to a stop. It doesn't mean accelerate through the intersection. Stop signs don't mean slow down. They actually mean stop. And ultimately, that becomes a quality of life issue, because whether you're driving, walking, or you're letting your child do those things are all in the back of your mind. And somebody will say, that's your worst problem? Well, there's just as many people getting hurt from traffic accidents. We don't need to have violent crime when we're not paying attention to the little things. So I would say primarily it's the traffic issues and day-to-day calls. I mean, there's calls that the public will never see. I mean, this morning I'm listening to the radio on the way in, and there's an out-of-control youth, and there's 2 young children at the house, and the parent has to go back. Well, you're going into somebody's house, and with that kind of report, and you're sending 2 officers and a supervisor, they have no idea who's going to open the door, the temperament of that person opening the door, what their intentions are. Because if they're willing to lose their temper and really start destroying the house with their 2 young siblings in the house, a police officer's uniform may or may not have the impact that's expected to. Yeah. So these men and women are taking that into account, and even more so, every one of your actions is going to be second guessed for days, hours, days, months on time, while you were expected to make a split-second decision of how you'd act.
Instant decision based on not a lot of information other than your experience and your instinct. I think people don't understand, and I haven't thought much about that psychological aspect of policing.
Right. I mean, how often do we catch ourselves in a meeting that you're thinking about what you're going to say, and you're like, oh my God, I'm glad I didn't say that. That would have come out the wrong way. But you had that moment to catch yourself or gather your thoughts of what's going to come out. Well, that happens on a car stop. That happens when you go up to somebody's house and it's becoming, a heated engagement. And they don't have that luxury of that, let me think about this before I say it, or let me do this before I act. It goes back to good training and making sure that while we're going through the hiring practicing, we're hiring the right people that can handle those kind of situations.
Are young people going into policing?
They're not. The numbers are so low right now of qualified applicants that it's very concerning. And at the same time, not only are they low for people looking to get into the profession, there's very good people leaving the profession. So it's not balancing out.
And at the same time, there are demands to hire more women, more minorities.
Right. Those, again, to give credit to the organization and my predecessors, we were, again, way ahead of the curve. I mean, we've always had a well-balanced department. At one point, the 64-person department had 15 female officers. I believe we're down to 11 now. We've always had minority officers within the force. It's just we can certainly do better.
And it's hard to find, I would imagine. You have to go.
It is.
You don't just accept applications. You have to go out and...
There's heavy recruitment, and we also quite honestly realize that we can't send, if we're sending officers for recruitment at universities and different locations, you can't just send white male officers, because a lot of people can't relate. You need that to break that initial ice that I could do this, or there's an opportunity for me there. They really need to believe that, not that we're just saying it to check off the box.
Yeah. I want to go back to the speeders.
Okay.
and the bad drivers. I know people in town say, why aren't the police catching more speeders? Why aren't they, stationing an officer at all these many choke points to help the flow of traffic?
So there was definitely a little bit of a lull in motor vehicle enforcement during COVID, and that was both for safety of the officers approaching cars, for COVID, not physical safety. I mean, it could be physical safety, but not somebody would harm you. Obviously, there was a point that there was a lot less traffic on the road, but people turned that into more speeding on the road because it was easier to do. So we definitely had our downtime of officers By no means not looking the other way in dangerous situations, but the routine stuff had definitely taken a back seat because people weren't comfortable with an officer walking up to the car. And are they wearing a mask? Were they vaccinated? Pre-vaccination, have they tested negative? There was all sorts of issues. So we definitely took a back seat, and that certainly had impact because it wasn't just us. It was happening all around us. So that word gets out fast, and people take advantage of that. We're certainly back into relatively heavy enforcement, but we're trying to do it also through education. We don't think that the ticket is always the answer. The bigger problem is the expectation of our community of how we handle traffic itself. And there's not a lot of options. Unless we were to say, if you don't live in town, you can't drive through town, there's really no variable. And with all the different apps, whether it be Google or whether it be Waze or different apps, to give you the alternate routes, there's no way of us controlling. So one of the things that comes up are, well, what if we put more police officers at key locations? So two things happen. When we put a police officer at a traffic light, it ultimately messes or it impacts the timing of the light before and the lights after that intersection, both ways. So now you're throwing off the timing at multiple different locations by the amount of traffic that you're sending. So while we think we may move traffic through one intersection a little better, we would certainly create a problem somewhere else. And an area that occurs is obviously Post Road and Route 33, because what happens is Post Road and Myrtle becomes a problem, and anybody who's made it up to Post Road and Campo, 7 cycles later, realizes that that was great that the intersection at 1 and 33 moved a little quicker, but this is not moving at all. Again, we have thrown the cycle off completely of how much volume that intersection can handle. The other part is, and people look at me like, oh my God, we don't want that type of look, is if we handle more traffic down in Saugatuck and we move, the idea when the traffic officer was put down there was that the train would come, 200 people would get off the train. That would mean approximately 200 cars needed to move through the intersection. Let's expedite that by keeping lights green a little longer, foregoing the no turn on red and having people keep moving. And now the train traffic would be done, and we wouldn't see another train 20 minutes, 22 minutes, maybe an hour, depending on the time of day. And that would work very well. The difference now is if we move that traffic well, we just get more traffic off I-95. And when we monitor the traffic coming off, we know that it's not Westport residents. There's no railroad sticker, there's no beach sticker, there's no high school sticker, there's nothing. We're inviting people from out of town to use our roadways because they're moving better than I-95 or the Merritt or Route 1. So the simple, let's get this intersection moving better. Well, if we get Bridge and Riverside before the bridge, on the west side of the bridge to move better, ultimately we're sending a lot more volume now up Bridge Street that's either going to turn on Imperial or South Campo or Hills Point of traffic that normally wouldn't be in town. So we're inviting more traffic by actually opening up that intersection.
Wow. So this is not a easy fix, and it's something that you have to deal with all the time, and it's tough to explain.
It's very hard to explain when people do sit down and actually understand where the traffic is coming from. I mean, it's endless. I-95, I've never seen it like this. Doesn't matter what time of day. It's backed up both ways, which is very unusual.
And a lot of accidents, too.
A lot of accidents. I don't know if it's newer drivers, people that have moved out to the area. I don't really have an answer for it, but it is probably the worst I've seen it, as both as volume, accidents, and creating issues on our back roads.
2 more questions.
Okay.
What issues, we're talking about speeding, what issues are under the radar or things that you're going to be thinking about now that might be issues in the months ahead?
Well, one of them we definitely touched on is the hiring process and making sure that qualified people that meet the standards of what our Westporters demand and deserve absolutely is meeting those standards. At the same time, I mentioned it earlier, Deputy Chief Archiola and I are coming closer to the ends of our career, so it's making sure that we're preparing, whether it be a year or 2 years or whatever the timeline may be, that the right people are in place to lead the organization as we continue to evolve and refine what the police department actually is. Those are major issues. An area that I think people don't realize is crime is up right now. And while we're not seeing violent crime, we never really had violent crime. So it would be strange if we saw an increase in violent crime since we never really had it. But the car theft, the larcenies, white-collar crime, and identity theft, I mean, people are walking into stores and walking right out with merchandise, and the managers are afraid to call because they're seeing what's happening at the national level and some of the encounters that people have. And they'll even wait till they're gone, they've left the area, and then they just need a report of what was taken. So it's society itself is looking at this in a different perspective of how much do I do, who do I put at risk, both physically and liability for the organization that they work.
You mentioned car thefts, and that was going to be my last question.
Okay.
I go berserk when I read a report of a car theft from a driveway where the keys were left in it and it was unlocked. What's up with that?
So if we continue to make ourselves victims, the criminals will continue to come. And that's only part of the issue. Look, if people are coming into town and they don't have to look very hard or very far to come into unlocked cars with expensive goods and the keys left in them, the only way we can prevent that is if everybody does their small part of locking their cars and bringing them in the house. I mean, that's not a heavy lift or a heavy ask. Now, that being said, our reform system, our prison system is not helping the situation. Our juvenile laws, I mean, you know, the state will tout that and I'm not pro-prison time, I'm not pro-incarceration, but at some point you have to look at what will work through therapy and other areas and what will not work at all, that incarceration is the only option. And that's a fine balancing act too. But when we look completely the other way and say, you know, we have the lowest incarceration rates we've ever had, well, that's because it's a revolving door. People get arrested, and before officers have even completed their reports, they're already out committing the same crime. And I'm not exaggerating with that.
Yeah.
We have, you know, juveniles that we arrest for motor vehicle violations. We release them. It doesn't have to be a parent. It can be a guardian or a relative. And they're getting arrested, and we're getting a phone call. Did you guys just release them? Yep. They were signed out immediately thereafter. Now, to contribute to that, and I'm a big proponent on this because we need to be careful if we're actually protecting our communities. And as a father, a husband, we can't go chasing criminals for property crimes and putting other residents at risk. But the way the laws are currently written, it leaves very little latitude on when you can do any of that. So if the criminal knows if I go to Westport, there's a good probability I'm going to get what I'm looking for. I may find a car, I may find stolen goods. And there's even a better probability that they're not going to chase me for a property crime because legally they can't. They're more at risk. And then there's even a greater chance that in the small percentage of people who get caught, I'll be out within a couple hours. Wow. What is the negative motivator? What's the sting to stop that person from doing that again?
So the bottom line is lock your car and bring the key inside.
Right. Lock the car. Really protect yourself. Keep the lights on. Really go back in your own way to neighborhood programs that your neighbors look out for you and you look out for them. I mean, the properties are big, so that's difficult in most neighborhoods in Westport. But really, you got to help yourself if we're going to try to mitigate this problem.
Great. Well, you certainly have helped us a lot. Anything I should have asked that I didn't? No. It's just the most frustrating, whether it be law enforcement or our local and regional or national politics, is I just feel like we've lost the area of compromise. I just feel the days of like sitting down and saying, we don't need to agree on everything, but if we compromise, I think we can both be in a better place. That's probably the most frustrating. It seems to be extreme. It's either my way or we're going to fight to the bitter end and we're going to create all sorts of issues, knowing that neither one of us are going to get exactly what we're looking for, and we're just delaying serving the community that we promised we would serve. Amen. Well,
All
Chief
right.
Foti Koskinas, you serve the community wonderfully. You've got a great force that we are both proud of and respect, and I appreciate your time today with 06880, the podcast.
Thank you. Again, I can't say enough thank yous to the men and women of the police department. They're the ones who actually make up what we actually produce, and my command staff, but we couldn't do it without the support of the community, and they've definitely stood behind us.
Well put.
Thank you.
Thanks again.